don't chase trends. We on the wave. Legos to the world. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build.
Continent DNA.
Pick it up right now. Whatever chocolate is near you. A bar, a piece, the wrapper in the bin. Pick it up. Look at it. The brand, the logo, the promise. Now, I want you to think about something. That thing in your hand or in your memory probably cost you less than a good cup of coffee. And the cocoa that went into it, the beans, the farmer who grew them, he made less than $1. Not less than $1 for the bar, less than $1 for an entire day's work. Now, here is the number that should stop you cold. Ivory Coast, a country in West Africa, smaller than the state of Texas, grows more than 40% of all the cocoa on earth. 40% of the entire planet's supply of the thing that goes into every chocolate bar you have ever eaten. And yet, Ivory Coast is not wealthy, not by the standards you would expect for a country that controls almost half of a global commodity. Its GDP per capita is roughly $2,000 a year. Compare that to Switzerland, where Nestle is headquartered. This episode is not about why that gap exists. It is about something more precise and more disturbing. It is about how Ivory Coast built that 40% deliberately and rationally, with a strategy that was, at the time, completely correct, and how that strategy, executed perfectly, built the most elegant trap in modern economic history. A trap with no villain, just structure. I am Tobe Duru. Welcome to Continent DNA, the show about great opportunities in Africa, the DNA of markets, and the playbook to thrive in them. And this is the story of the cocoa century. Felix Hopehate Bujoni, pardon me if I did not pronounce that name correctly, was a farmer before he was a president. That matters. In a world full of independent era African leaders who were lawyers, professors, military men, he was something different. He had walked the land. He understood from the inside what it meant to grow something and watch someone else capture the value. He was born 1905 in the village of Yamoussoukro. His family were chiefs. They owned land. They had standing in the community. And when the French colonial administration began pushing cocoa cultivation in what was then called Cote d'Ivoire, his family planted. He watched cocoa become money. He also watched the French take most of that money. Not through theft, but through structure, through the way the entire system was designed, who processed, who shipped, who set prices, who had the contracts. He did not learn this in a classroom. He learned it standing on a farm, watching the numbers never add up in his family's favor. That stayed with him. In fact, it shaped everything he did next. By 1944, he had founded the first major African agricultural union in French West Africa, the Syndicate Agricole African. The point was simple. African farmers were being taxed to subsidize French settlers. French planters paid lower export duties. African planters paid higher ones. Same crop, different rules, depending on the color of the person who grew it. He fought that and he won. And in winning, he learned something he would spend the next 50 years proving. In a commodity system, the most important lever is not the product, it is the rules around the product. Fast forward to 1960, Ivory Coast becomes independent. Tobe Duru becomes president. He is 55 years old. He has spent his whole life studying how power and money move through colonial agricultural systems. And he has a country to run. His theory was this: Ivory Coast has land, it has climate, it has labor, but it does not have technology, it does not have international market access, not on its own terms. So, what do? You pick the thing you can actually grow. You grow it better than anyone else. You grow it more than anyone. You make yourself indispensable. And you use that indispensability to buy time, time to build schools, infrastructure, capacity until you are ready to move up the chain. That was the plan. It was not naive. It was a sequence strategy, which is phase one, volume, phase two, leverage, phase three, transformation. He chose cocoa and coffee, but cocoa especially. The conditions were almost supernatural. The southern half of Ivory Coast sits in what agronomists call the cocoa belt, a narrow band between 10 degrees north and 10 degrees south of the equator, where the soil, rainfall, and temperature are almost precisely right for growing Theobroma cocoa. The name, by the way, Theobroma, is Latin derived from Greek. It means food of the gods. The gods in the story are mostly in Tourish and Brussels. He built the system first. He slashed taxes on smallholder farmers. He kept land rights accessible, unusual for a newly independent African state. He told farmers, essentially, clear the forest, plant cocoa, and the government will buy whatever you grow. And they did. Hundreds of thousands of them, even millions. Between 1960 and 1980, Ivory Coast cocoa production went from roughly 50,000 tons a year to nearly half a million. That is a tenfold increase in 20 years. The forest paid for it. Roughly 75% of Ivory Coast's original rainforest was cleared during this period to make room for cocoa farms. The trade off was explicit, not reckless. The Ivorian Miracle, they call it. Economists flew in from Paris and Washington to study it. GDP growth running at 7, 8, 9% per year through the 1960s and 1970s. Roads were built, schools open, cities growing. It worked, to be honest, undeniably, concretely, measurably, it worked. And at the center of it all was the Kaistab, CAISTAB. CAISTAB is the marketing board of cocoa in Ivory Coast. Think of it as a government shock absorber for cocoa prices, and a shock absorber is exactly the right image. Here is how it worked. When global cocoa prices were high, the CAISTAB bought cocoa from farmers at a fixed price, lower than the market, and kept the difference in a reserve fund. When prices crashed, and in commodities they always crash, the Kaistab used those reserves to keep paying farmers the same fixed price, even when the international market had collapsed beneath them. Stability, predictability. The farmer wakes up knowing roughly what a ton of cocoa is worth to him this year. That certainty was the engine of expansion. Without it, smallholder farmers, people farming 2 or 3 hectares, no saving cushion, no access to credit, could not have taken the risk of planting a crop that takes 5 years to mature before it bears a single pod. The Kaistab made that risk manageable. It was elegant and it worked, at least for a while. 4 years into independence, Hope sits with his economic advisors. The World Bank has just completed its assessment of Ivory Coast. Their recommendation is diversify. Don't concentrate on 1 or 2 crops. The risk of commodity dependence is well documented. His finance minister agrees. The numbers support diversification. Hope listens, but then pushes back, not with ideology, but with arithmetic. You need capital to diversify. You need technical capacity you don't have. You need time to build institutions that don't exist yet. What you have right now is land and labor and a crop the world wants. You don't play the game you wish you were playing. You play the game in front of you. He doubles down on cocoa. It is the most rational decision in the room, and it is a decision that will shape the lives of 4 generations of Ivorians who have not yet been born. But building the supply was only half the story. The other half is who built it. Because Hope's system did not run on corporations, it did not run on plantations, it ran on families. And what happens to those families, what they learn, what they risk, what they cannot change, that is the engine of everything that follows. Here is something most people do not know about Ivory Coast cocoa industry. It is not an industrial operation. There are no vast corporate farms, no combined harvesters rolling through endless fields, no satellite guided precision agriculture at scale. Over 90% of Ivory Coast cocoa is grown by small holder farmers, individual families. The average farm is 2 to 4 hectares. To get a sense of that, a hectare is roughly the size of a standard football pitch, 2 to 4 football pitches of cocoa trees. That is a family's entire livelihood. Everything they have, everything they risk. There are roughly 1 million of these farms, each one operating semi independently, each one connected to the national system through a chain of buyers and exporters and government oversight, of course, that stretches from a dusty path in the forest to a container ship in Abidjan port. That system is operates through masterpiece, not the Kaistab, not the physical policy, but the network. The way he connected a million small decisions into a single economic engine. The farmer's year runs like this. He plants, or more likely, he tends trees that his father or grandfather planted. Because a cocoa tree takes 3 to 5 years to bear fruits and then produce for 25 or 30 years. He harvests twice a year, a main crop that runs from October to March and a mid crop from May to August. He opens the pod by hand with a machete and a practice stroke. No machine does this cleanly. The cocoa beans are inside, surrounded by a white pulp that smells surprisingly like sweet melon. He ferments the beans, laid out in wooden boxes or under banana leaves for 5 to 7 days. This step is not optional, it is where the flavor develops. The chemistry of fermentation is what separates cocoa that makes great chocolate from cocoa that makes normal chocolate. Then he dries them in the sun. He bags them, 60 kilo bags, roughly the size and weight of a grown man, and then he sells to a pisteur, a local buyer. That word means tracker in French, who comes to the farm on a motorcycle, cash in, and a portable scale is strapped to his back. That pisteur says to a traitant, a regional aggregator who consolidates beans from multiple pisteurs. The traitant sells to a licensed exporter in Abidjan. The exporter sells to a processor or trader on the international market. 4 steps between the farmer and the sheep. Each step takes a margin. The farmer is at the bottom. Now, here is the number that defines everything. The farm gate price, what the farmer actually receives for a kilogram of cocoa beans, has historically averaged somewhere between 70 cents and $1 per kilogram of cocoa. That same kilogram, once cleaned, roasted, ground, pressed, refined, tempered, and turned into finished chocolate on a supermarket shelf, generates somewhere between $5 and $15 in retail value, depending on the brand, the positioning, and the market. Same kilogram, 10 to 15 times the value. The farmer in Ivory Coast captures roughly 6 to 8% of the final retail value of the chocolate made from his beans, just 6 to 8%. The rest, the 92 to 94%, goes to processors, traders, manufacturers, retailers, marketing budgets, logistics, and the layers of financial services built around all of it. Not because anyone stole it, but because that is where the work happens that the world will pay for. And that work does not happen in Ivory Coast. Why not? That question is the center of this entire episode. And the answer is not that simple. But let us start with the farmer himself, because his position is rational too. A smallholder farmer with 2 hectares and a family to feed cannot wait 5 years for a processing plant to be built somewhere near him. He cannot take the price risks of holding beans while he tries to negotiate access to a market he has no relationship with in a language that might not be his. For a quality standard he has no way to verify or even certify. He cannot buy a drying facility or a fermentation chamber. He does not have the working capital. He does not have the collateral to get credit. So he sells to the pistol because the pistol shows up. Cash today is better than anything else. That is not ignorance. That is the correct decision given his constraints. And the constraints were in important ways by design, not maliciously, but structurally. Hope's system maximized volume. It was engineered to get as many farmers growing as much cocoa as possible, as fast as possible. The price stability the Kaiser offered was real, but it also made the system legible only from the top. The farmer did not need to understand international cocoa futures to participate. He just needed to grow and sell. And that legibility, that simplicity kept him exactly where the system needed him to be, growing, selling of cocoa. Totally dependent on the next step in the chain to tell him what his crop was worth. But here is where the story gets more layered. The farmers were not just swept along by forces they did not understand. Because if you look at it, they moved, they migrated, they organized their lives around cocoa in ways that were creative, adaptive, and sometimes brutal. The expansion of cocoa farming in Ivory Coast pulled in hundreds of thousands of migrants from neighboring countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, who paid actively encouraged this. His famous phrase, the land belongs to whoever makes it productive, that was a deliberate opening. Labor was needed, and the labor came. By the 1990s, roughly a quarter of Ivory Coast's entire population was foreign born, most of them connected in some ways to agricultural labor. This created a society that was extraordinarily diverse and, in time, extraordinarily combustible. The land rights that had seemed generous in the 1960s, plant it, grow it, it is yours, became contested as the forest ran out and the children of original farmers clashed with the children of migrants over who owned what. And then one word started circulating, Ivory. It means Ivorians, who was truly a citizen, who had the right to the land. This is not a digression from the economic story. It is the economic story. Because the political crisis that consumed Ivory Coast from the late 1990s onward, the coup, the civil war, the decade of instability, they all grew directly from tensions first seeded by the cocoa expansion. The system that built the economy also built the fractures. By the mid 1970s, Ivory Coast had become the world's largest cocoa producer. It has held that position for over 4 decades now. Today, together with Ghana, which holds about 15% of global supply, West Africa controls roughly 60% of all cocoa production on earth. That is a concentration of supply that will make any antitrust regulator sweat in almost any other industry. But cocoa is not like other industries because the power is not where the supply is. The power is where the demand is. And that demand is in Europe, in North America, in the boardroom of Nestle and Mondelez, Mars, and Hershey. Cities where Ivory Coast cocoa becomes billions of dollars of products and where Ivory Coast itself is invisible. So now we have the supply, we have the farmer, we have the network, we have a country that has bet its entire development strategy on a single crop. And we also have an international market that needs exactly what Ivory Coast produces. By all logic, this should be a story of accumulating leverage. The more supply you control, the more power you have. That is how commodities work. That is how oil works. That is how diamonds work. And that is how semiconductor works too. Except cocoa is different. The question is why? And the answer requires us to look at the thing nobody in Ivory Coast control, the chain itself. So imagine you grow wheat and someone else makes bread. You control the fields, you control the harvest. They control the mill, oven, the bakery, the chef, the brand. So who has the power? Now imagine that your wheat, unlike ordinary wheat, cannot become bread without a very specific industrial process, a process that requires machines costing hundreds of millions of dollars, a process that produces multiple intermediary products, each one going somewhere completely different, and each one requiring its own specialized buyers, logistics, chains, quality standards. A process where the quality of the final product is shaped not just by the quality of the raw ingredient, but by secret recipes, specialized equipment, and customer relationships built over decades. Now you understand the cocoa value chain. Let us walk through it. A cocoa bean leaves a farm in Ivory Coast at what the industry calls a raw bean. It has been fermented and dried. It smells faintly of vinegar and chocolate. At this point, it is a commodity. It arrives at a port in Abidjan and it is loaded into a container. It crosses the Atlantic. Step one of transformation includes cleaning, roasting, cracking, winnowing. This happens at a grinding facility. Most grinding facilities of any significant scale in the world are owned by one of three companies: Barry Callebaut, headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland; Cargill, headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota; Olam Agri, headquartered in Singapore, with deep infrastructure across West Africa. These three companies together control a commanding majority of the world's cocoa grinding capacity. They are not just household names. You probably have never seen their logo on a chocolate bar before, but they sit at the midpoint of every chocolate product you have ever eaten. They are the invisible layer, and invisible layers in supply chains tend to be extraordinarily profitable. The grinding produces what the industry calls cocoa mass, also called cocoa liquor though there is no alcohol in it, just the confusing vocabulary of industrial chemistry. From that mass, two things are separated under high pressure: cocoa butter, which is the fat, and cocoa powder, which is the solids. These two products then diverge into entirely separate value chains. Cocoa butter goes into chocolate manufacturing and also, crucially, into cosmetics, lip balm, body lotion, skin cream, that entire industry. Cocoa powder goes into hot chocolate drinks, baked goods, industrial food applications. The point is this: the moment you grind a cocoa bean, you are no longer trading a single commodity. You are trading multiple products into multiple markets simultaneously. That complexity creates value, but that complexity lives downstream, far downstream of Ivory Coast. And then comes manufacturing. The major chocolate manufacturers, Nestle, Mondelez, Mars, Ferrero, Hershey, buy cocoa mass and cocoa butter from the grinders and add it to make sugar, emulsifiers, and flavors to turn it into finished chocolate. This is where the brand value is created, where the Cadbury Dairy Milk premiums exist, where the elite 70% dark chocolate commands $15 for 100 grams. These brands have spent decades and billions building consumer loyalty, distribution networks, retail relationships. The farmer in Ivory Coast contributes the raw ingredient. He has zero relationship with the consumer, zero brand equity, and zero pricing power over the finished product. Here is a number that crystallizes this. In 2023, the global chocolate confectionery market was valued at roughly $130 billion. Ivory Coast total cocoa export revenue, the entire national cocoa sector, were approximately 3 to 4 billion dollars. 130 billion on one side, 3 to 4 billion on the other. Ivory Coast captures roughly 2 to 3 cents of every dollar of retail chocolate value. Why can't Ivory Coast move up the chain? To be fair, it has tried. This is important to say clearly. The answer is not passivity. After the structural adjustment programs of the late 1980s, when the World Bank and IMF pushed Ivory Coast to liberalize its agricultural sector, dismantle the KISTAP, and open its market to private enterprise, the country's processing capacity did grow. Today, Ivory Coast grinds roughly 500,000 tons of cocoa per year, making it, by volume, the world's largest grinding nation. That is a meaningful achievement, but it is grinding, the first step, the lowest margin step. Ivory Coast ships semi-processed product, cocoa butter, cocoa powder, cocoa liquor, to European and North American manufacturers who add the brand value, the distribution, the consumer relationship, and charge 10 to 15 times the price. And those manufacturers are protected in that position by trade policy calibrated precisely to reward these arrangements. This is one of the most important structural facts in this entire story. Listen to this. The European Union's import tariff on raw cocoa beans entering Europe is 0%. The tariff on processed cocoa products, chocolate bars, cocoa preparation, finished confectionery, is between 8 and 30%. Zero on raw, but 8 to 30% on processed. This structure has a name. Economists call it tariff escalation. Trump, USA, right now comes to the mind. And it is not an accident. It is a future. It is trade policy designed rationally from the perspective of European manufacturers to ensure that the highest value processing happens inside Europe, not in Ivory Coast. The price of admission for Ivory Coast to sell finished chocolate to European consumers increase with every step up the value chain. The system actively penalizes exactly the upgrade Ivory Coast needs to make. Every time Ivory Coast try to add more value before exporting, the tariff door swings a little more closed and it gets more complex. Even if you overcome the tariff, you face what I call the brand problem. A Nestle Kit Kat is not valuable because of its cocoa. It is valuable because it is Kit Kat. Because of a century of advertising, retail relationships in 180 countries, consumer habits built across generations, shelf placement in every airport, motorway, service station, and supermarket in the developed world. How do you compete with that? With what capital? Starting from what distribution base? Reaching which consumer through which channels? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine strategic question. And the honest answer from inside Ivory Coast for most of the last 60 years is you cannot quickly, cheaply, without taking a level of risks that a country at Ivory Coast income level cannot responsibly absorb. The trap is not a lock, it is a series of rational decisions made by rational actors at every level of the chain that collectively produce an outcome that is irrational for a system as a whole. The farmer sells raw because it is a safe choice given his constraints. The government extracts value from the chain to fund schools and roads and salaries because it needs the revenue today, not in 10 years. The processors stay in Europe because the tariff structure reward them for it. The manufacturers build brands in Switzerland and in the United States because that is where the consumers and the capital are. The traders build warehouse in Rotterdam because Rotterdam is where the infrastructure exists. Nobody is the villain. The structure is the villain in the story. And here is the thing about structural villains. They are the hardest kind to fight. You cannot arrest a tariff schedule. You cannot negotiate with a brand's accumulated equity. You cannot upbuild a century of Rotterdam infrastructure in a decade. You can only change it slowly at enormous cost over a very long time. And if you have the political stability and institutional patience to hold the position long enough for the change to take hold, which brings us to the reckoning. We are now at the heart of the trap. Ivory Coast controls the raw material. The chain is designed to ensure that raw material is the least valuable part of the transaction, and the country's entire fiscal architecture, its schools, its roads, its civil service, its military, depends on revenues extracted from that least valuable part, which means that breaking free from the trap is not just an economic question, it is an existential one. Because the moment you try to redirect, to stop feeding the raw end of the chain and start building something further up, the revenues that keeps the country running drop. Before the new revenues arrive, that gap, that period of pain between the old system and the new one, that is where development strategies normally die. Hopate Bojani is 82 years old. He has been president for 70 years now, and the system he built is under existential pressure. The global cocoa price has been falling for years. The Kaistab has been paying farmers above the international market rate, drawing down its revenue to do so for so long that the revenues are nearly exhausted. The country's foreign debt is mounting. The World Bank and IMF are cycling with conditions, and Hopehead decides to do something that stuns the international community market. He declares a cocoa war. He stops selling. Ivory Coast, the country that controls 40% of global cocoa supply, unilaterally withholds its beans from the international market. The logic on paper is impeccable. If you control 40% of supply and you stop selling, prices must rise. This is basic economics. You don't need a master degree or MBA to understand this. Oil exporters had done something similar in 1973. It had worked. The international traders had built their entire business model on one assumption that Ivory Coast would always sell because the farmers needed the cash and because the government needed the export revenues. And because, more importantly, the beans spoil, it cannot last forever. However, the strategy of Hupate to withhold the selling of cocoa did not work, at least not in the way he hoped. What happened is that prices rose briefly, but a few weeks of volatility and the traders found other ways to buy their cocoa. They pulled stock from warehouses in Rotterdam and Amsterdam that they had been quietly building for exactly this kind of situation. They drew down their inventory buffers they bought from other countries like Ghana, Cameroon, and Indonesia, where production was growing rapidly and whose farmers asked no political questions. Ivory Coast had cocoa for half and a year. The farmers stopped receiving payment, and the government revenue, of course, collapsed totally. The cocoa sat in warehouses in Abidjan and slowly started to degrade due to tropical heat and humidity. Beans that were fermenting when they should have been selling, losing in quality, in value every single day. At the end, Ivory Coast capitulated and sold at prices lower than what they had actually wanted. The cocoa war cost the country an estimated $1 billion. 1 billion, yes, that's right. In a country whose entire GDP at the time was roughly 10 billion. So 10% of the national economy are spent in a failed price negotiation. The lesson the war took from this is Ivory Coast cannot withhold its cocoa, not for long. The structural dependence run too deep. The farmers cannot hold. The government, too, cannot hold. The beans themselves cannot last for a very long time, which means the threat of withholding is not credible, which means you are not, in any meaningful sense, a monopolist. You are a price taker with a large market share. So in 1989, Cocoa War ended and the trap closes finally for Ivory Coast. What followed afterwards was the era of structural adjustment. The World Bank and IMF's prescription for a country in a fiscal distress was, by the late 1980s, fairly standardized. Dismantle the marketing board, liberalize the sector, let the market set prices, attract private investment, and reduce the state role in the economy. And to be fair, the Kaistab had real problems by then. Money that was supposed to protect farmers had been quietly redirected. Roads built in the president's hometown, vanity project constructed, and budget holes filled with funds that were never meant for that. The liberalization happened across the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Kaisab was finally dismantled and private traders were invited, and the results were mixed in ways that should make any honest economist pause for a long time. The private traders were more efficient. The corruption of the old system declined. But the price stability that had been the entire engine of farmer participation was gone. These were farmers who had spent their whole lives in the system. Suddenly, the price of their crop was being set by traders they had never met, in markets they had never heard of, in cities on the other side of the world. Nothing in their daily reality told them why the number changed. It just changed. The reforms optimized for efficiency and delivered instability to the people least equipped to absorb it. Hope died in December 1993. He had been the constant, the strategist, the man whose personal relationship with farming and with the peculiar logic of commodity systems had given the whole architecture its coherence. And after he was gone, the country came apart in ways it never had before. In 1999, the military took over. Ivory Coast had existed for nearly 40 years without that happening. A rebellion in 2002 that split the country into north and south along lines that were partly ethnic, partly economic, and entirely rooted in the land and citizenship tension the cocoa expansion had created 40 years earlier. Then, in 2010, a disputed election tipped into open violence. 3,000 people died. Each crisis caused the transformation agenda. Each pause cost years, and each lost year compounded the structural position. The Conseil du Café Cacao, the regulatory body that eventually replaced the KaiStab, tried to build something new, like a minimum price guarantee, so farmers had something to hold onto. Certification schemes for sustainable cocoa and selling a portion of the crop forward so revenues were more predictable. These were genuine efforts. Some produced rare results, but the fundamental architecture, millions of small farmers producing raw and semi processed beans, selling into a chain controlled by three grinding companies and five chocolate manufacturers remained. And here is the compounding problem, the one that does not get enough attention. The land is running out. Remember the original deal: clear the forest, plant cocoa. The forest is almost gone. Ivory Coast has lost over 80% of its original rainforest since independence. One of the most dramatic deforestation stories on the continent. And farmers started pushing into the only forest left, the Thai National Park in the southwest, one of the last stretches of original West African rainforest, a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site. Satellite imagery shows this clearly. Farmers pushing in from the edges, each family making the same rational decision. There is forest, there is no enforcement, there is demand for cocoa. You cannot expand production by clearing new land anymore. The land is gone, which means the only path to more production is higher yields from existing farms. To grow more from the same land, you need better seeds, fertilizers, disease management, training. Each one costs money, and the farmer who needs all of it is the same farmer who can barely cover his family's food from one harvest to the next. Most smallholder farmers in Ivory Coast farm under customary tenure arrangements. Their right to the land is recognized by the community, not by a document that a bank will accept. So it is a chain of problems where you cannot solve one without first solving the one before it. And so far, none of them have been solved at the scale that matters. And while all of that remains unsolved, the climate is not standing still. The cocoa bed is shifting. Temperature and rain pattern in West Africa are changing too, in ways that threaten the very climatic conditions that made Ivory Coast the world's cocoa capital. The CGIAR, the Global Agricultural Research Consortium, has modeled scenarios in which large portion of Ivory Coast's current cocoa growing areas becomes climatically unsuitable by 2050. The suitable zone shifts south or in higher elevation toward areas that are currently either protected forests or inhabited by communities farming other things. The structural trap is not only economic, it is ecological, and it is accelerating on a timeline that does not respect the pace of institutional reform. And there is one more layer, the one that the industry discusses quietly and the media covers loudly, and nobody has actually solved: child labor. The International Labour Organization estimates that roughly 1.5 million children in West Africa are involved in hazardous work in cocoa farming, the majority in Ivory Coast and Ghana, using machetes, applying pesticides without protective equipment, carrying loads too heavy for their bodies, missing school during harvest weeks that stretch to months. The global chocolate industry has been making promises about this since the Hacking Angel Protocol was signed in 2001, a voluntary commitment by the major chocolate companies to eliminate the worst forms of child labor in their supply chains. That was 24 years ago. The numbers have not declined significantly. Not because no one cares, not because the companies have not spent money on programs, but because child labor in cocoa is not a random crime that policing can prevent. It is a structural response to poverty. A farmer earning 70 cents a kilogram, farming 2 hectares, net of imports, barely earning enough to feed his family. That farmer has labor cost problem. His children are labor, not because he is cruel, but because the marks of his situation demand every available body in the field during harvest. Solve the income problem genuinely sustainable at a scale, and you create the conditions in which keeping children in school becomes economically rational. Satisfy the farm without solving the income problem, and you have a certificate and the same children. The industry has for 2 decades preferred the certificate. So, where does this leave us? We have a country that built something extraordinary, a supply chain of genuinely historical scale and sophistication, a network of 1 million farmers, a chain that feeds 40% of the world's chocolate industry. And we have a country that is 60 years later still waiting for the second and third phases of Hope Hate's original plan. The leverage, the transformation, the moment where volume converts to power. What would it actually take and what would it cost? Here is what you can take from the story. This is not a story about Africa, or rather, it is not only a story about Africa, it is a story about commodity traps, about what happens when a country, a region, a company becomes structurally essential to a value chain it does not control. It happens in oil, in rare earths, metals, agricultural commodities across the developing world, in technology, hardware, in any sector where the raw input and the finished product are far apart in geography, in capital intensity, in brand equity. And the exit, when there is one, always looks roughly the same. It requires three things simultaneously. First, sustain political will over a time frame that is longer than any single government, any single term, any single leader. The transformation from raw commodity exporter to value added producer takes decades, not years. South Korea moved from textile exporter to automobile and semiconductor manufacturer over 30 years of consistent industrial policy. Malaysia moved from rubber and palm oil exporter to electronics manufacturer over a similar arc, deliberately with state support, with a tolerance for short term costs. Neither transition was smooth. Both required the state to absorb losses, real losses, paid for by real people in real time. In the period between the old system and the new one, Ivory Coast has not 30 consecutive years of political stability since independence. That is not a critique. It is a structural fact with a specific, quantifiable cost. Second, a buyer at the end of the upgraded chain. You cannot process more cocoa into finished chocolate if no one will buy Ivorian chocolate at a price that makes the capital investment worthwhile. The tariff problem must be addressed at the WTO in bilateral agreements. In the terms of Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, which, if implemented with genuine seriousness, creates a market of over 500 million people on the African continent itself for branded Ivory products. That market is real. It is growing faster than any other consumer market in the world by population trajectory. The African middle class spent over $1 trillion on a consumer goods in 2020. That number is growing too. The question is whether anyone builds a genuinely Ivorian chocolate brand in time, one that owns its origin story. Third, and this is the hardest one, the one that requires the most political courage. The farmer must be paid more before the transformation is complete, not after. The entire incentive structure of cocoa farming is currently optimized for quantity over quality. Grow more, sell more, and you survive. Farmers who earn more, who have a margin above their subsistence, invest in their farms. They use better inputs. They maintain their trees properly. They ferment carefully. They dry properly. In fact, they do everything properly. These practices produce better cocoa, and better cocoa commands premium. Premiums fund more investment, and the cycle continues, but only once it starts. And it cannot start at the current farm gate prices. The living income differential was a step in the right direction. A $400 premium on a ton of cocoa translates to roughly $30 annual income increase for the average smallholder. The gap between current farm gate earnings and a living income is estimated by researchers at somewhere between $400 and $600 per year per farming household. The lead closes perhaps 5 to 8% of that gap. It is necessary, but it is not still enough. And this is what I keep coming back to. For the first time in a long time, Ivory Coast and Ghana are pulling in the same direction on price, not undercutting each other, not racing to sell first. They are holding the line together. 20 years ago, there was no continental trade framework worth speaking of. Now there is, though it is incomplete, but it exists, and that is a very good start. And there is something else. Climate pressure might actually force the investment that prevent poverty because the choice is no longer transform or stay the same. It is transform or watch the farms die. That changes the calculation. And on the ground, something else is shifting too. A generation of Ivorians who studied abroad, who understand global markets, who have access to capital, are coming back and building chocolate brands and agricultural technology companies, not waiting for government policy to open the door, but building their own doors. Not because a government told them to do so, but because they built something people actually want to buy. That is not transformation yet, but it is the beginning of the conditions for transformation, which is a different thing from where the story was 20 years ago. The question that remains, the one that Hope Hate himself laid out at independence and never fully answered, is this: Can a country use commodity dominance as a bridge to something else? Can you turn 40% of global supply into genuine structural leverage? Not just price leverage, but the leverage to say to the buyers of the world, if you want this ingredient, you build the facility here. You train Ivorians to run it. You pay taxes here. You create job here. Saudi Arabia did something like this with oil. It took 50 years. It required extraordinary revenue and extraordinary political stability and a willingness to absorb enormous short term pain for long term position. Malaysia did something similar with palm oil and then with electronics. It required an industrial policy that stayed consistent across multiple governments for 3 decades. It is not impossible, but it requires a state with the institutional capacity to hold the position under pressure. And it requires a moment, a market moment, when the buyers need you more than you need them. Those moments are rare and they do not wait. Ivory Coast is right now sitting on one of the most consequential commodity positions in the global food system. The world wants more chocolate. Emerging market consumption in China, in India, across Southeast Asia, and across Africa itself is growing at rates that dwarf the growth of traditional Western chocolate markets. Supply from other regions is constrained by climate, by land availability, by the decades of investment required to establish new cocoa growing areas at scale. The world is going to need more Ivorian cocoa, not less. The question, the only question that matters now, is whether Ivory Coast has finally built the political stability, the institutional capacity, the entrepreneurial infrastructure, and the strategic patience to make that need work for its farmers. For the first time, after 60 years, that is the question, and it does not have an answer yet. But now, at least, you know what is at stake. You had it in your hand at the beginning of this episode. That piece of chocolate, the bar, the wrapper, it hasn't changed. But I don't think you will look at it the same way. I am Tobe Duru. This is Continent DNA. If this episode changed the way you see a supply chain or any supply chain, share it with one person who needs to hear it. We will see you on the next one.
We on the wave, Legos to the world. We build, we brave, we build, we brave, we build, we brave, we brave, we build.
Continent DNA with a hustle.